Here is what I remember most about the morning I bought back the hotel where I used to carry trays for a living. It was not the number on the wire transfer. It was the sound the marble made under my heels when I walked across that lobby for the first time as its owner. The exact same click it made 8 years earlier when I walked across it as staff, in flat black shoes with a tray balanced on one palm, trying not to spill champagne on men who never once looked at my face. It is a strange thing to hear a floor sound identical, while everything standing on top of it has completely changed. But that morning was the end of this story, not the beginning. To understand how I got there, you need to go back 4 months, to the day Kwon stood on a stage in front of 300 investors and accused me, his own ex-wife, of stealing the company I had spent 6 secret years building. He thought that stage would break me the way the ballroom once did. He didn't know I had been waiting 18 months for him to be foolish enough to attack me somewhere with witnesses. My name is Zara Mensah. If this is the first time you are meeting me, here is the short version. I was a black waitress from Atlanta working private events in Seoul when I married Kwon, the head of one of Korea's most powerful crime families. A man whose legitimate hotel and luxury holdings quietly hid a much older shadow empire underneath them. His family called me the waitress for 6 years, at every dinner, in front of every guest, like it was a ceiling I would never rise above. What none of them knew, not Kwon, not his father, not the mistress he celebrated on my birthday in our own ballroom, was that I had spent those same 6 years secretly rebuilding the Kwon family's entire public-facing luxury empire under a faceless consultancy called Aiden Noir. When they finally humiliated me one time too many, I walked out, filed for divorce, and let the truth surface at an industry gala in a room full of the exact people who mattered most to them. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The waitress they underestimated had been the architecture the whole time. I thought that story was finished the night I accepted my industry award and walked out of that ceremony without looking back. It was not finished. It had only gone quiet, the way a house settles after a storm and everyone inside mistakes the stillness for peace. 6 months after that award, Aiden Noir had become something the Kwon family could no longer politely ignore, even if they wanted to. 41 active clients across 6 countries. A design and strategy team of 22 people who had never once heard me raise my voice in a meeting, because I had learned a long time ago that calm is a more expensive currency than volume, and I intended to spend mine wisely. I took a run-down harbour property in Busan that nobody believed in, stripped it back to its bones, and turned it into the most photographed hotel opening in the country that year. A journalist from a design magazine asked me at the ribbon cutting what the secret was. I told her there was no secret. I had simply spent 6 years learning exactly what makes a room feel like it was built for you instead of around you, and I applied the same principle to a hotel that everyone else had written off. She printed that quote on the cover. I kept a copy in my office, not out of vanity, but because it reminded me of the exact sentence I once said to a bored man at a corporate dinner, back when I still thought insight alone would be enough to change my life. It turned out insight was only the beginning. What actually changed my life was refusing to stop building quietly, even when nobody was watching. I remember one client meeting from that stretch in particular, not because it was our biggest contract, but because of what it taught me about how differently people treated me once the title Aiden Noir was attached to my name instead of the title Kwon's wife. A restaurant group in Singapore flew a delegation to Seoul specifically to meet me, and their lead partner spent the first 10 minutes of that meeting apologizing, unprompted, for something none of us had discussed yet. He said he had read about the ballroom, about the mistress, about the 6 years of being called a waitress, and he wanted me to know he found it appalling that anyone had treated a woman of my ability that way. I thanked him. And then I told him something I have found myself repeating often since. I did not need his sympathy for what I survived. I needed his contract reviewed by Friday. He laughed, surprised, and signed within the week. That is the version of respect I actually trust now, the kind that shows up as a signature, not the kind that shows up as an apology for a past nobody is asking anyone to relive. I turned down 2 acquisition offers that year, both from firms with names far bigger than mine, because I understood something those firms never quite grasped about me. The moment you sell the thing you built out of nothing, you hand someone else the pen you used to build it, and I had spent too many years without a pen of my own to ever hand mine over voluntarily. I kept it. I intended to keep it for the rest of my life. Ju-won, meanwhile, spent those same 6 months discovering exactly how difficult it is to run an empire once the person who had been quietly holding the blueprint underneath it is no longer in the house. It did not happen all at once. That is the cruelest kind of decline, the slow kind. The kind that shows up first as a hotel opening that performs adequately instead of spectacularly, then a restaurant launch that gets polite reviews instead of headlines, then a fashion partnership that fails to move the culture the way the last 3 had. Every project the Kwon Group launched without Aiden Noir's fingerprints on it underperformed within a quarter. Sometimes visibly, sometimes just enough for investors to start asking careful, polite, extremely expensive questions in board meetings that Chairman Kwon did not enjoy answering. I learned about one of those meetings much later, from Min Rae, and I have thought about it often enough that I want to tell it the way she told it to me. It took place 4 months before Investor Day, in the same glass-walled tower, a routine quarterly review that stopped being routine the moment the fashion division's numbers came up on the screen. Chairman Kwon reportedly asked his son, directly, why a partnership that should have doubled the division's visibility had instead barely moved it at all. Ju-won said the market had been difficult. His father asked what had been different about the 3 partnerships before it, the ones that had each become the most talked-about launch of their season. Ju-won did not have an answer, because the honest answer was a name he was not yet ready to say out loud in that room. His father reportedly said only one sentence in response, and let it sit there. Find out what changed, he said, and fix it. Ju-won left that meeting already knowing exactly what had changed. He simply refused, for 4 more months, to admit it to anyone, including himself. A company can survive losing a wife. It has a much harder time surviving the slow public discovery that the wife had been the architecture the entire time, and that nobody currently working there knows how to draw without her. So somewhere in those 6 months, the Kwon family started looking for a way to take the architecture back. And that is where Sooyeon returned, for the 2nd time. Though it would take me weeks to understand just how far ahead of everyone else she had already gotten. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters to the story. Sooyeon did not vanish quietly after the Spring Luxury Forum the way it appeared from the outside. She left Seoul, yes. She lost her family's invitations to every gala that mattered, yes. Her family's business was investigated and diminished, yes. But a woman who spends 15 years perfecting a smile does not simply stop performing because one room finally saw through her. She relocated to Milan under a different professional surname, quietly attaching herself to a European luxury conglomerate that had never heard the name Aiden Noir and had absolutely no reason to look it up. And for a 1.5 years, she waited, rebuilding piece by piece, because patience turned out to be the one skill nobody had ever needed to teach her. I pieced most of what happened next together afterward, from documents and testimony and the kind of careful reconstruction Cho Yoon-ji's team does better than almost anyone in the country. But I believe it happened close enough to this. Ju-won reached out to her first, not the other way around, through an intermediary who described himself only as a friend of the family, looking to reconnect old colleagues. They met in a private dining room at a hotel that was not one of ours, which I imagine felt significant to both of them, though probably for different reasons. You look like a man whose company is losing money because he lost the wrong person, Sooyeon reportedly said to him before he had even finished sitting down. I need help managing a perception problem, he said. No, she said. You need help managing a truth problem. There's a difference. Perception problems need a good story. Truth problems need someone willing to make the truth inconvenient enough that nobody wants to look at it directly. He asked her what that would take. It takes a room full of witnesses, she said, and a woman on stage who has never once, in her entire life, been given the chance to explain herself before the damage was already done. He asked her if it would work. It worked on you for 6 years, she said. It will work on a room for 6 minutes. That's all we need. She had chosen her setting carefully, according to what surfaced later. A private dining room, not a boardroom, because boardrooms make men think about accountability, and private dining rooms make them think about being understood. She let him order first. She let him talk about the falling numbers before she said a single strategic word, because she needed him to arrive at the idea of blaming me on his own, so that later, if anyone ever asked, he could honestly say the idea had been his. I do not know if that conversation happened in exactly those words. I know its shape from what Min Rae overheard and what surfaced later in the governance review. But I believe the shape is close enough because it explains something that puzzled me for a long time, which is why Kwon, a man who had watched me dismantle his family's certainty once already, agreed to walk into the exact same trap a second time. He was not being clever. He was being managed by a woman who understood something about him that I had spent 6 years learning the hard way myself. He had never once needed to be right. He had only ever needed to feel, for a few minutes at a time, like the most powerful person in the room. Sooyeon offered him that feeling back, cheaply, and he paid for it with everything he had left. What it actually was, when you strip away every polite word either of them used to describe it, was a plan to accuse me, publicly and formally, of building Aiden Noir on stolen Kwon Group intellectual property during our marriage. The theory was elegant, in the specific way that lies constructed by people with legal departments tend to be elegant. I had been his wife. I had lived inside the household. I had, therefore, in their telling, had privileged access to internal strategy documents. My consultancy's early methodology resembled certain internal Kwon frameworks. Therefore, Aiden Noir was never truly mine. It was theirs, wearing my name as a disguise, and it was time the world knew it. It did not matter that it was false from the first sentence to the last. It only had to be believable enough to spook investors for 90 days. 90 days was all Sooyeon calculated. She would need to quietly walk 3 of my largest clients over to a brand new consultancy she had already registered in Hong Kong, fronted by people with impressive titles and no actual experience renovating a single hotel between them. She was not building a company. She was building a landing pad, timed to open exactly when my reputation would be too damaged to defend it. And Kwon, still hungry to be the man who finally beat me at something, agreed to be the mouth that said it out loud in public, because his name still carried enough weight to make the accusation land in the first place. Sooyeon needed his platform. He needed to believe, one more time, that he could win. I found out about the entire plan 9 days before the Kwon Group's investor day, and I found out from a person none of them ever suspected would tell me anything at all. Min Rae had kept her word since the night she apologized to me privately after the spring forum, a promise she never advertised and never once broke in the 18 months since. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice low and careful, the way people speak when they are choosing to be brave about something quietly instead of loudly. I remember exactly where I was standing when the phone rang, in my kitchen, holding a glass of water I never finished drinking. "My brother has been working with communications for 3 weeks," she said. "A statement. About you." I asked her what kind of statement. "They're calling it an intellectual property review," she said. "They're going to say Aiden Noir was built using things you saw inside our house. At Investor Day. On stage, in front of the press, so you can't answer back the way you did last time." I asked her how she knew. "Because Sooyeon's name came up in 2 meetings I wasn't supposed to overhear," she said. "She's in Milan. She's the one who wrote the language. Zara, I think she's been planning this since the forum. I think she never actually left." I asked her why she was doing this, risking her own standing in the family a second time, when the first time had already cost her so much inside that house. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. "Because I spent my whole life watching my family decide who deserved a seat at their table," she said, "and I am tired every single time of finding out they were wrong. I watched them call you a waitress for 6 years while you built the only parts of this company that were actually still working. I am not going to sit quietly through them calling you a thief too." I told her I would need everything she could get me. Dates, names, the exact wording, if she could find it. She said she already had the wording, because Sooyeon had insisted on approving every draft personally, and Min Rae had photographed the final version on her brother's desk 2 nights earlier, before he moved it into a locked folder. I spent the 9 days that followed the way I spend every crisis, which is to say, I did not panic, and I did not call a single client to offer premature reassurance, because reassurance before proof is what guilty people reach for first. On the first day, I called Cho Yoon-ji, who had handled my divorce with a precision that never once needed to raise its voice, and who answered on the second ring like she had been half expecting this call for a 1.5 years already. I sent her Min Rae's photograph of the draft statement. She read it twice, in silence, then said one sentence that I have thought about many times since. "They wrote an accusation they cannot survive fact-checking," she said. "That is not a weapon. That is a confession with a delay on it." On the third day, I sat in a conference room with Priya Rao, my head of records, a quiet woman with an almost frightening memory for dates, who had spent 5 years digitizing every file Aiden Noir had ever produced, time-stamped, notarized, and backed up in 3 separate countries specifically because I had never once trusted powerful families to fight fair. I asked her to pull the earliest material we had, everything from before the marriage, and lay it out chronologically on the table. She did not need 3 days to do it. She had it organized within 4 hours because she had, in her words, been keeping this particular folder ready since the week I first told her who I used to be married to. 11 notarized documents, filed with the National Intellectual Property Registry 8 months before I ever married BWAM at all, proving the core methodology behind Aiden Noir had existed as my own registered work long before I ever set foot inside a Kwon household. On the 5th day, I sat with Dae-hun, my head of security, a former corporate intelligence officer who had never once raised his voice in the 4 years he had worked for me. I asked him about the corridor. "You remember it if you watched the first part of this story. 2 men, polite voices, a quiet warning to withdraw a business filing 18 months earlier." I had never used what came out of that night, out of something that was not quite mercy and was not quite strategy either. It was patience. I have always been very good at patience. "We have the recording," Dae-hun said. "Full audio, clean chain of custody, verified. And we traced the payment for the men who approached you that night to a private security contractor. The contractor's invoices lead back to a holding company. The holding company is owned by Park Sooyeon's family. I asked him if it would hold up publicly, if I needed it to. "It will hold up anywhere," he said. "The only question is whether you're finally ready to use it." I told him I was. On the morning of Investor Day, I put on a black blazer with no gold on it anywhere, because this was not a night that called for armor that sparkled. This was a morning that called for armor that simply did not move, no matter how hard someone pushed against it. I walked into that glass-walled auditorium on the 40th floor of the Kwon Group Tower an hour before the doors were meant to open, just to feel the room empty before it filled. And then I found my seat in the 4th row, not the front, because I wanted Ju-won to see me the moment he looked up from his notes, and I wanted him to spend every minute before his remarks wondering exactly why I looked so calm. By 10 o'clock the room was full. 300 investors in soft grey suits, a scatter of financial journalists near the back with laptops already open, a stage lit clean white, a single podium, a single microphone. It was the kind of room built specifically to make announcements feel inevitable, the kind of room where powerful men said things and expected the world to simply agree with them because the lighting was expensive enough to make disagreement feel impolite. I noticed director Lim Song-jin 2 rows ahead of me, the same man who had crossed a gala floor 18 months earlier and said my industry name out loud for the first time in public. He turned once, caught my eye, and gave me the smallest possible nod, the kind that says I see you without saying anything a journalist could quote. Chairman Kwon sat in the front row, unmoving, the way he always sat, like stillness itself was a form of authority. I noticed he did not look back once toward the 4th row. I noticed he did not need to. He already knew exactly where I was sitting. I spent the 15 minutes before he took the stage doing something I rarely allow myself to do in a room full of strangers, which was simply sitting still and letting myself feel exactly how far I had come. 8 years earlier, a room like that one would not have let me sit in the audience at all. I would have been the person carrying the water pitchers along the side wall, invisible in exactly the way rooms like this are designed to make certain people invisible. Now I was sitting in the 4th row in a blazer I had chosen deliberately, holding a folder that could end a man's career, waiting for him to make the mistake I already knew he was about to make. I did not feel triumphant, sitting there. I felt something quieter and, I think, more useful. I felt ready. Ju-won took the stage at 10:15. He talked for nearly half an hour about quarterly growth targets, occupancy rates across the hotel division, a new fashion partnership launching in the autumn, the ordinary architecture of a company trying very hard to sound like nothing underneath it had shifted. I watched him check his notes twice in places where 6 months ago he would never have needed to check anything at all. I watched 3 separate investors in the row ahead of me glance at their phones during the parts that should have held their attention the most. Then, at 10:41, he said my name. He was careful about it. He did not simply announce an accusation the way a man in a hurry would. He built toward it the way people trained by expensive communications teams are taught to build toward difficult news, framing it first as a matter of, quote, corporate governance and intellectual transparency, unquote, before he ever said the words Aiden Noir out loud. It has come to our attention, he said, that the founding methodology behind a consultancy operating under the name Aiden Noir may have been developed using privileged internal access obtained during a period of close personal proximity to Kwon Group strategic operations. He did not say my name at first. He let the room connect it themselves, because someone had clearly told him that would land crueler than saying it outright. 300 people turned their heads, slowly, almost politely, one section at a time, toward the 4th row. I watched every single one of them arrive at my name in their own mind before BWAM ever had the nerve to say it out loud himself. Somewhere behind me I heard a journalist whisper the word wife to the colleague beside her, and I heard the colleague whisper back, "Wait, that's her. That's Aiden Noir." If you have ever sat completely still in a room while someone tried to turn your success into a crime, drop your city in the comments right now, because I promise you already know exactly how steady your hands have to stay in that moment and how much it costs to keep them that way. I did not stand. I did not raise my hand. I let him finish. He announced that Kwon Group Legal would be pursuing what he called a formal review of intellectual property provenance regarding Aiden Noir's founding methodology, language chosen specifically so every journalist in that room could report it within the hour as a serious allegation rather than the empty threat it actually was. Sooyeon's fingerprints were all over the phrasing. BWAM had never once in his life been careful enough, on his own, to construct a sentence built that cleanly to survive a fact check. When he finished, the moderator opened the floor for questions, and that turned out to be the single largest mistake in a morning that was about to be full of them, because he had built himself a trap with a door in it, and he had completely forgotten that doors work in both directions. I raised my hand. I want you to understand exactly how this happened, because I think the calm matters more than the confrontation. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up dramatically or storm the stage the way this moment might play out in your head. I simply raised my hand the way anyone does at an investor conference, unhurried. And when the moderator, visibly uncomfortable, finally called on me, I stood, buttoned my blazer, and asked one single question in a voice that did not shake even slightly. I asked whether Kwon Group Communications had independently verified the filing dates on whatever documents this claim was based on. BWAM said yes. I opened the folder. I read 3 notarized registration numbers aloud, slowly, so the room's own attorneys could write them down in real time. I explained, calmly, that these 11 documents, filed with the National Intellectual Property Registry, proved my original hospitality consulting framework, the same framework Aiden Noir was later built on, had been developed and formally registered 8 months before I ever married Kwon Ju-won at all, not adapted during the marriage. Not lifted from a household I had access to. Built first, alone, by a 23-year-old waitress with a hospitality degree and absolutely nothing else, in a small rented room, long before any Kwon family document had ever crossed my desk. I said the room could verify every claim independently through the National Registry within the hour if they wished, and that I would be publishing all 11 documents on Aiden Noir's own website by noon, so nobody would have to take my word for anything at all. A second investor stood, an older man I did not recognize, and asked, carefully, whether the company had run this allegation past its own outside counsel before making it public. BWAM's silence answered that question more clearly than anything he could have said out loud. The room did not gasp, the way rooms do in films. It did something quieter and far worse for BWAM. It went completely still. In the specific way 300 people go still when they are simultaneously doing expensive mental arithmetic about how much money they are about to lose by remaining publicly associated with whoever turns out to be wrong. Comment the word recepts if you saw exactly where this was going before he did. I was not finished. I said there was a second matter the room deserved to know about, since transparency seemed to be the theme of the morning. I explained, calmly, that 18 months earlier, 2 men connected to a private security contractor had approached me in a corridor and asked me, politely, to withdraw an active business filing. I explained that my security team had recorded the exchange in full, and that we had since traced payment for that contractor directly to a holding company owned by the family of Park Sooyeon, who I understood was currently advising the Kwon Group's communication strategy from Milan under a different professional name. I did not play the recording. I did not need to. I simply stated, clearly, that it existed, dated, verified, and available to the company's own board upon formal request. Sometimes the mere existence of proof does more damage than the proof itself, because it removes the only thing a liar has left to hold on to, which is the hope that nobody actually bothered to check. Sooyeon was not in that room. She had been far too careful ever to attach her name publicly to any part of this. But careful only protects a person until someone else says their name out loud in a room full of 300 phones, and by noon that same day, 4 separate financial outlets had already connected the quiet Milan consultancy to the very family business that had collapsed in Seoul the spring before. She had spent 18 months carefully building a new name for herself. It took me 1 sentence to reattach the old one, permanently, in a room she was not even standing in. Within a month, the Asian Luxury Industry Association, the same body that had once given me an award on a stage while Sooyeon watched from the crowd, quietly removed her from its advisory roster, citing conduct inconsistent with the association's governance standards. It was not a dramatic expulsion. There was no press release, no statement, just a name missing from a list where it used to appear, which is often how these things actually end for people like her. The Milan conglomerate she had attached herself to distanced itself within the week, releasing a short statement confirming that her role had been, quote, discontinued, unquote, language chosen to sound procedural rather than damning, though everyone who mattered understood exactly what it meant. Her family, according to Min Rae, stopped returning her calls entirely by the following spring. Access had always been the only currency Sooyeon ever really traded in, and once enough rooms had quietly agreed she was no longer worth the risk of admitting, there was nothing left underneath the performance to rebuild with. I never heard from her again, not one message, not one attempt to explain herself. I think, in the end, she understood there was nothing left to say that would have changed anything, and for a woman who had spent her whole life believing the right words could fix any room, that silence was probably the closest thing to an admission she ever gave anyone. Ju-won stood at that podium and said nothing for what felt, to everyone watching, like a very long time, because there was genuinely nothing left he could say that would not make everything worse. I watched him do the exact thing he had done in the ballroom a year and a half earlier. He looked instinctively toward his father, sitting perfectly still in the front row, waiting, I think, for some flicker of rescue. His father did not look back at him, not once. I left through the side entrance while the room was still absorbing what had just happened, because I had learned a long time ago that the person who controls the exit controls the story that gets written about the room afterward. A cluster of journalists caught me in the corridor outside, cameras already up, someone shouting my name. Both names, actually, Zara and Aiden Noir, like they were still deciding which one belonged to me now. I stopped, because refusing to stop would have looked like I had something left to hide, and I said one thing, slowly, so it would be easy to quote correctly. Every document I referenced this morning will be public by noon. I would encourage anyone reporting on this story to read them before they write a single word. Then I kept walking. By evening, that sentence had run under 6 different headlines, in 6 different phrasings, and every single one of them had somehow made Ju-won look worse than if I had said nothing at all. By noon, exactly as promised, all 11 documents were live on Aiden Noir's website, alongside a short statement Priya and I had drafted together the night before Investor Day, in case I needed it. It said very little. It listed the registration numbers, the filing dates, and one line at the bottom that I insisted on keeping even though our own communications advisor wanted it cut for sounding, in her words, too personal for a corporate statement. The line read, "I built this before anyone in that family knew my name. I am happy to prove it as many times as necessary." Within an hour, The page had been shared by two of the same financial journalists who had been sitting in the back row that morning, both without further comment, because the documents did not need commentary any more than the investor withdrawal figures had. Before any of the calls came in, I called my own team together first, all 22 of them, in the main studio at 7 that morning, before a single client or journalist had a chance to reach us. I did not want anyone hearing about the accusation from a headline before they heard it from me. I told them exactly what had happened, exactly what was true, and exactly what we were going to do about it, in that order, because I have never once believed people work well for someone who tells them a comforting story instead of an honest one. One of my youngest designers, a woman named Ha-yoon, who had joined us straight out of university 2 years earlier, raised her hand the way people do when they are nervous about a question that matters to them. She asked if the studio was in danger. I told her the studio was not in danger, because everything the accusation claimed was false and provable, and that we were going to prove it publicly by noon. She asked what she should say if a client called her directly. I told her the truth was the only script anyone in that room needed, and that if she ever felt unsure what to say, she could simply tell them to wait for the documents. Nobody in that studio left the building that day. Priya told me later that half the team stayed until nearly midnight, not because I asked them to, but because they wanted to be there when the page went live. The first call I received that afternoon was not from a journalist. It was from one of the 3 clients Sooyeon's team had been quietly courting in Hong Kong, a hotel group based in Singapore that had signed with Aiden Noir 8 months earlier and had, according to Priya, taken 2 meetings with the new consultancy without telling us. Their chief executive called me directly instead of going through his own communications office, which told me almost everything I needed to know before he said a word. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "We were approached. We were told your consultancy might not survive a legal challenge." "That's a fair thing to have been worried about," I said. "The documents are public now. I'd encourage your legal team to review them before we talk further, rather than take my word for it." There was a pause on the line, the kind I had learned to read as a person doing quiet arithmetic. "We'll review them," he said. For what it's worth, I never doubted the work. I doubted whether it would be worth the exposure of staying associated with the story. "I understand," I said. "That's a reasonable thing to weigh. I'd only ask you to weigh it after reading, not before." He called back 2 days later to renew the contract early, for 3 additional years, without being asked. Not every client called back. One did not, and I let them go without argument, because I have never once believed a relationship built on fear of a headline was a relationship worth keeping in the first place. But most of them called, in their own time, once the documents had done the only kind of persuading I have ever fully trusted, which is the kind nobody has to perform. By the end of that week, the damage had stopped looking like a scandal and started looking like something far more permanent, because scandals eventually fade from headlines and balance sheets do not forgive nearly as easily. 14 institutional investors requested emergency briefings within 72 hours. 3 publicly paused their positions in the Kwon Group's legitimate holding division, pending what their statements called leadership clarity. The exact phrase I had once used against this same family a year and a half earlier, except this time it belonged entirely to people who had never heard my name until that morning and had no personal stake in seeing me win. The board called an emergency session on a Thursday, 11 days after Investor Day. I was not in that room, but Min Rae described it to me afterward in enough detail that I could piece it together clearly. 13 directors around a long glass table, Chairman Kwon at its head. Won 2 seats down from him instead of beside him for the first time in 6 years, a placement everyone in that room understood as a message before a single word was spoken. An independent director opened by reading the investor withdrawal figures aloud, one by one, without commentary, because the numbers did not need commentary. Won reportedly tried to speak twice during that reading, and was asked, both times, quietly, to wait until the figures were finished. When he finally got his turn, he argued that the accusation had been made in good faith, based on communications advice he had trusted, and that removing him now would only confirm to the market that the company had something to hide. "We move forward united," he said, "or we hand every advantage we have left directly to her." Min Rae stood before anyone else could respond. "I move," she said, "that Kwon Ju-won be removed from all public-facing leadership of the legitimate holding division, pending a full governance review, on the grounds that he authorized a formal public accusation the company's own legal department was never asked to verify in advance." Ju-won turned to his father. "You're going to let her do this?" Chairman Kwon did not answer him directly. He read the investor withdrawal figures back, once more, from memory, without looking at his notes. "You made an accusation on my company's stage," he said, "that a 23-year-old waitress had already disproven 8 years before you opened your mouth. You did this without my counsel reviewing it. You did this because a woman in Milan told you it would work." He paused. "I second the motion." There was no dramatic outburst after that, Min Rae told me. No shouting, no walkout. Just a vote, 13 hands, only one of them raised against, and Ju-won's, which had not been raised for anything. I was not in that boardroom, and I did not need to be, because I had already won the only version of that fight that had ever actually mattered to me. Nobody would ever again be able to call me a thief in a room full of witnesses without 300 of those same witnesses, plus a national registry, plus a dated recording, proving otherwise. Min Rae told me one more thing about that afternoon. Something she almost did not mention at all. After the vote, after the room had emptied and the directors had filed out toward their cars, she found her father still sitting at the head of the long glass table, alone, the way he rarely allowed himself to be seen. She asked if he was all right. He did not answer the question directly. He said only that he had spent 6 years calling the most capable person in his family's orbit a waitress, and had somehow convinced himself the whole time that the insult cost him nothing. I do not know if he ever said anything close to that to me directly, and he never has, not once, in the time since. But I believe Min Rae told me the truth about that moment, because it is exactly the kind of thing a proud man only ever says once, to no one in particular, in a room he thinks is empty. 2 weeks after that board session, the Kwon Group's own leadership approached Aiden Noir's holding company with an offer. Not a partnership this time. A sale. They needed liquidity fast, the specific kind of fast that only comes from wanting an expensive crisis to disappear from the news cycle before the next earnings call. And the fastest asset available to move, without triggering a shareholder revolt, was the Cheongdam Grand, the very hotel where a tired rich man once asked a waitress to bring him a specific bottle of water from the bar and then made the mistake of actually listening to what she said next. Cho Yoon-ji negotiated the purchase over 11 days. I did not attend most of those meetings personally. I did not need to be in the room to know what my own 5 years of contracts were worth, and I had learned, a long time ago, that the person who needs the deal least should never be the one doing the talking. Their opening offer undervalued the property by a wide margin, the kind of number a company sends when it is hoping the other side is more desperate than it actually is. Cho Yoon-ji rejected it in a single line and did not send a counter for 3 full days, which she told me afterward was the most important part of the entire negotiation, because silence, deployed correctly, tells a desperate buyer everything they need to know about who actually controls the timeline. By the 8th day, the number had moved close enough to fair that she recommended I accept, not because we could not have pushed further, but because I had told her from the beginning that this was never really about the price. It was about the deed. On the 12th day, she called me and said one sentence. "They accepted," she said. "It's yours. I bought it. Not with revenge money, and not with any settlement from the marriage. I bought it with 5 years of contracts, time-stamped, notarized, undeniably mine, converted into the single largest acquisition Aiden Noir had ever made. I signed the paperwork standing in the same lobby where I once carried trays through crowds of men who looked straight through me like I was part of the furniture that came with the building. Priya stood on one side of me. Cho Yoon-ji stood on the other. Min Rae, who I now consider something much closer to a real friend than a former sister-in-law, stood just behind me and cried a little, quietly, in a way she apologized for immediately and did not need to. Ju-won was not there. By then, he had already been quietly repositioned to a minority board seat with no operational authority at all. A soft landing his father arranged, I think mostly to protect the family name rather than to protect him specifically. Sooyeon's Milan consultancy folded within a month of the story breaking, once 4 separate European partners discovered exactly what her family's Seoul business had actually collapsed for the spring before. She did not attempt to resurface a third time. Some people build their entire identity out of access to rooms that other people control, and once every room in the world has quietly agreed to stop letting them in, there is nothing solid left underneath to rebuild with, no matter how many new surnames they try on. I stood in the marble lobby of the Cheongdam Grand on the morning the sale closed, and I looked down at the same floor I used to walk across in flat black shoes with a silver tray balanced on one palm. And I thought about how long it sometimes takes a room to finally notice who has actually been holding it up the entire time. If any single part of this made you sit up a little straighter, tell me which word did it. Was it recepts? Was it the lobby? Was it watching a man accuse the woman who quietly built his entire company of stealing it, in a room where she owned every piece of proof that mattered? BWAM found me there 3 weeks after the sale, standing near the same corner of the lobby where he had once complimented my thinking about scent profiles and lighting on the night we met. He looked smaller than I remembered him looking. Not physically, but in the specific way a man looks once a room finally stops automatically arranging itself around him. He said he never meant for any of it to go that far. I told him that was the tragedy of men like him. They never mean for it to go that far. They only ever mean for it to go exactly as far as it takes to win. And they are always, every single time, genuinely shocked when the person they underestimated turns out to have been quietly counting the whole way through. He asked if there had ever been a version of this where we ended up on the same side again. I told him there had been one, a long time ago, back when he was a man at a corporate dinner who noticed a waitress thinking about something more interesting than the room around her and actually stopped to ask what it was. That version of him listened. This version of him stood on a stage and accused me of theft in front of 300 strangers because he could not survive admitting, even privately, that everything he had built his adult life on top of, he had built directly on top of me. He asked, quietly, what would have happened if he had simply told the truth from the beginning? If he had stood on that stage and told the room his ex-wife had built the company's most valuable division and he had no case against her at all. I told him I honestly did not know, and that it did not matter anymore, because the version of him capable of asking that question a year and a half ago had never once shown up when it counted. I did not stay to watch his face change. I had already learned that particular lesson once, in a different room, a long time ago. Watching a man finally understand exactly what he lost does not undo the losing, and it was never my job to sit with him through it a second time. I turned and walked back across my own lobby, past my own front desk, under my own chandelier, and out through doors that had once only opened for guests I was paid to serve, and now opened for no one but me. She won again. Not because she raised her voice on that stage, and not because she needed anyone in that room to gasp. She won because she had spent 18 months being patient with a piece of evidence she could have used the day it happened, and chose instead to wait until it would actually matter. She won because she let a man build his own trap in public and simply declined to walk into it. She won because every single receipt she carried into that room had been true for years before anyone thought to question her, and truth, kept long enough and documented carefully enough, does not need to be loud to be undeniable. She won because the people who once needed a title to explain her worth now needed her signature to close their own deals. And she won, most of all, because when they tried to take the one thing she had built entirely on her own, she did not simply defend it. She used their own desperation to buy the very room where they had first decided she was nothing. I think about that often now, standing in that lobby some mornings before the staff arrive, before the first guests come down for breakfast, when the marble is empty and quiet, the way it was empty and quiet the morning after my very first shift there, 8 years ago, when I was too tired and too proud to admit how much my feet hurt. I was 23 years old then, and I did not know a single thing about hotels or empires or holding companies. I only knew that the room deserved better than it was getting, and that nobody had asked me, so I decided, quietly, to notice anyway. Every single thing that happened after that, the marriage, the humiliation, the divorce, the reveal, the accusation, the acquisition, all of it traces back to a 23-year-old who simply refused to stop noticing things nobody had given her permission to notice. That is the part of this story I want you to actually keep, more than the folder, more than the stage, more than the sale. Permission was never the thing that built any of this. Attention was. So tell me, honestly, which part of this hit hardest? Was it the accusation itself? A man standing on a stage and calling the woman who built his company a thief? Was it the folder? 11 documents that had been true for 8 months longer than the marriage that supposedly explained them? Was it Sooyeon's name reattaching itself to her, permanently, in a room she was too careful to even enter? Or was it the lobby, the exact same floor, the exact same click of the same heels, except this time nobody in the room got to decide who she was allowed to be? They thought accusing me on a stage would be the ending of my story. It was only ever the proof they handed me to write the next chapter myself. Because some women, when you push them all the way out of the room, do not leave quietly and stay gone. They come back later, on their own schedule, with a folder full of dates that never once stopped being true, and they buy the building.